World leaders are gathering in Turkey for a high-stakes NATO summit with the alliance under growing pressure from the United States. All eyes are on U.S. President Donald Trump, who has accused member states of not spending enough on defense. The two-day meeting in the capital, Ankara, is aimed at bolstering unity and deterrence. Ahead of the main session, Trump was hosted by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Well, shortly after arriving, President Trump said he would lift sanctions on Turkey that were imposed in 2020 after Ankara purchased a missile defense system from Russia. Trump also said he's considering lifting his ban on sales of F-35 fighter jets to Turkey. He said he has a great chemistry with President Erdogan, and if the summit wasn't being held in Turkey, he would not be there. Trump also said he's very disappointed with NATO for not supporting his war against Iran. The U.S. president told reporters that asking European allies for help in the war against Iran was a test.
And in a way, I was testing people. I was testing to see whether or not they'd be there, because I'd long said that we help them, but I'm not sure that they'd be there for us. And Italy turned us down, and Germany turned us down, and France turned us down. And it's okay, but, you know, why are we spending hundreds of billions of dollars and they're not there for us? We've always been there for them.
Our correspondent Teri Schultz joins us now from the summit. Teri, NATO was nervous about what kind of mood Trump might be in when he arrived there. How do you think these remarks we just heard in that clip will be received?
Well, Terry, I think that everyone was expecting that Trump would continue complaining about the response of European governments to his war on Iran. But what may not have been expected and will come as an unpleasant surprise is that in further remarks there with President Erdogan, Trump also brought back his complaint about Greenland and said that the U.S. should control Greenland, not Denmark, and said that, you know, there are Russian and Chinese ships surrounding the island, which we should point out is not true. But I don't think anyone was expecting Greenland to make a resurgence at this summit. So they were prepared to defend their record on Iran, saying that, you know, we did allow the U.S. to use our bases for its attacks on Iran. But I would presume that on the Greenland comments, they're just going to pretend it didn't happen.
It seems like the summit, to some degree, Terry, is just about managing Donald Trump. How much effort ahead of this summit was spent on preparing to deal with him?
That is how it seems at the moment, and there was a lot of effort put into this. Not only has the summit's final declaration already been negotiated, it's already been agreed at the level of ambassadors at NATO, in part because they just don't want to allow Donald Trump to negotiate something like this and possibly hold up the whole process. But in addition, 2 weeks ago, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte flew to Washington for this express purpose. He brought colorful poster boards showing how much more the allies are spending since Trump's first term. He called it the Trump trillion in big letters, showing Donald Trump the allies are stepping up just like you demanded a year ago at the Hague summit. They are on track to spend this 5% of GDP. He also pointed out how many jobs this creates in the United States and how many back orders U.S. weapons companies have from European buyers. So there was a lot of effort made to see that this would be smooth sailing. We'll just have to see tomorrow if that works out.
Now, Terry, I know you've been speaking with NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation there at the summit. What did he have to say?
That's right. This is the man who's in charge of NATO's innovation programs. He tries to work in the latest technology to what NATO is buying, to how NATO is training. And of course, when you talk about this, you cannot ignore the fact that there's no country more advanced than Ukraine. So I asked him what lessons the alliance needs to learn from what Ukraine is suffering. Let's hear what he had to say.
So all the lessons we see in Ukraine are arriving everywhere. And so it's a question of speed now. How fast we integrate these new things to be better protected, to lose less people. You don't pay a pension when you lose a drone. You pay a pension when you lose a soldier. So it's better to lose a drone. And so these new ways of doing the war are arriving very fast.
Now, Teri, there were $50 billion worth of new weapons deals signed today at this forum called the NATO Defense Industry Forum, and a lot of that money will be spent on drones, not surprisingly.
So, Teri, tomorrow is the real big day of the summit. What can we expect to happen there?
Well, of course, because Trump is a key player here, we can't be entirely sure. But what this declaration says, which we've seen that I mentioned has already been agreed, at the very top of it is something that may seem so fundamental for NATO. It's its founding principle, you know, an attack on one is an attack on all, the famous Article 5. Now, that is something that is being restated in this document just because NATO allies feel so unsure sometimes about President Trump's unwillingness to do that. So they will be very relieved if this document goes through and is approved by all the leaders. There are also some other key points. 70 billion euros is expected to be promised to Ukraine this year, including 30 billion from the European Union and a similar amount next year. Those are two of the key points that they are hoping sails through with approval from all 32 leaders tomorrow.
Teri, thanks as always. DW's Teri Schultz there in Ankara. Increased support for Ukraine is expected to feature heavily on day 2 of the agenda. Ukraine's stockpile of Patriot missiles systems is empty, and President Volodymyr Zelensky made this appeal.
While this war continues, please help us get more air defense missiles. This is our top priority right now. We are capable of doing everything else ourselves. But when it comes to air defense, we need our partners' determination. Please, let more determination and more decisions for air defense be one of the key outcomes of this NATO summit in Ankara.
Let's bring in Aylin Matlé here. She's a senior research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, focusing on security and defense. Aylin, how much attention is Ukraine likely to get at this summit, given that Europe and Canada are so focused on keeping Donald Trump happy and committed to the alliance?
Well, clearly the main focus will be paid to defense spending, and also how increased defense spending is going to translate into greater capabilities and also more potent capabilities. And I think that is really on the top of the agenda and minds of European leaders and also Canada. That being said, I think Europeans and also Canada can also include Ukraine into this calculation by ways of pointing out that Ukraine is obviously a recipient of Western military aid, but at the same time, increasingly becoming a supplier of European security and European security provisions by ways of its drone production capabilities, and also the lessons it can draw from having fought an active war against Russia for the past 4.5 years. So I think those two topics on the agenda are not contradictory in terms.
So we have the Europeans and Canada too, of course, thinking about Ukraine, wanting to help Ukraine, but Europe and Canada, they're also trying to prevent Donald Trump from further weakening America's commitment to NATO because the United States is still critical. Are Europe and Canada doing enough to keep the U.S. on board with their defense spending, for example?
I think there is not really much more that European leaders could do. I mean, they have been on a upward trajectory in terms of defense spending, not only since last year, but for the better part of the past 10 years. I mean, obviously, the war against the full-scale invasion and war against Ukraine gave those efforts and endeavors a significant boost. And that is something that European allies can certainly point to. And surely there are things that Europeans could do in terms of the provision of critical capabilities, but not necessarily in the short run, but rather in the medium and in the long term. And I think one of the really critical questions that will have to be answered is how to organize the burden shifting question that really looms large over the summit in Ankara. And by that, I mean how Europeans will take on a greater share of the burden in the transatlantic relationship, which not only President Donald Trump, but also many other presidents before him have called for.
In his opening address at the summit, NATO Chief Mark Rutte, he talked about Russia's war machine and how much of a threat that poses. Do you think that NATO, as a military alliance, is a deterrence, a credible deterrence in Moscow's eyes right now?
Militarily speaking, I would say so, but obviously the question of whether deterrence works or not can only be answered by the actor that is supposed to be deterred. And then, when deterrence works, it's a bit difficult to prove that it has worked because nothing, luckily, has happened. And if it hasn't worked and let's say Russia would attack NATO territory, we wouldn't be able to determine for sure whether that comes down to certain provisions in NATO's deterrence and defense capabilities, or which exactly have failed to work. But so I would say politically.
Of course. I mean, everything you said, of course, is very true. I'm just wondering, from your reading of how Moscow is positioning itself and it posturing, do you think it is really concerned about NATO?
I think it is. And I think one indicator of that could be that Russia is now increasing its attacks on Ukraine again, and is doing so in order to send a signal to the alliance not to further support Ukraine. And I think the reason for that is that Russia is increasingly realizing that there is really no easy way out for Russia to win this war. And when considering that Russia is not even able to defeat Ukraine, it is a bit difficult to imagine at the moment that it would be able to defeat an entire alliance of 32 nations, including 3 countries that possess nuclear weapons.
What, from a European perspective, would qualify as success at this NATO summit in Turkey?
I think a clear success would result in a summit declaration or communique, which clearly communicates the message that the alliance is solidified, that it is an alliance that really stands together and has each other's back, including not only Europeans, of course, but almost more importantly, I would argue, with the United States still on board. And there are signs that point into that direction, that Donald Trump is not going to sabotage the summit by ways of really pointing to the fact that the U.S. is no longer able and no longer willing to support its mission and its contributions to NATO.
Turkey is hosting for the first time a NATO summit. What does Ankara want out of this summit for itself?
So yes, Turkey is hosting this summit for the first time in many, many years, and in a completely different strategic environment compared to when it hosted the summit last in 2004. I think the main goal on Erdogan's mind is to really showcase Turkey's capabilities in terms of defense production capabilities. And I would say to a certain extent, rightly so, because the Turkish defense industrial base really has seen a boost over the past couple of years. For example, in the realm of drones, and I think Erdogan is going to really use that summit to also in economic terms to sign deals and to bring home deals for his own defense industry. And then secondly, I think he will also try to present himself as a sort of bridge builder between Trump and European allies, since he does have, at least for the time being, a rather friendly relationship with Donald Trump.
Aylin, thank you very much. That was Aylin Matlé from the German Council on Foreign Relations.
We want to take a closer look at the role of Donald Trump and the U.S. at the summit. And I'm pleased to welcome former NATO Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemoeller for that. Rose, welcome back to the day. Trump really arrived in Ankara guns blazing. He didn't come to the summit to play nice, did he?
No, but you know that Donald Trump loves to grab the headlines, and the way he grabs the headlines is by not playing nice and by criticizing the allies and by criticizing everything that's going on around him. So he certainly is playing that game again.
Is that also how he gets what he wants, though?
I think it has been in the past. Clearly, when I was NATO Deputy Secretary General a decade ago, and it was Trump's first term in office, the allies were shocked by this kind of behavior, and it frightened them, quite honestly. And so it did lead to all of the allies really working hard to get to 2% of GDP on their defense expenditures. That was a good thing. And we supported it at the time of the Secretary General Stoltenberg at that time, and I both supported that effort to get the allies to step up. I think now they're a little bit inured to this behavior. They expect it from Donald Trump.
Mark Recep is known as a bit of a Trump whisperer. In your opinion, has he found the right way to handle Trump, or is appeasement only going to embolden him even more?
I think that Rutte is a very experienced politician. He wasn't the leader of the Netherlands for so long, and he wouldn't know how to handle various difficult situations. I know he's gotten a bad rap for being a bit too obsequious around Trump, but I think his performance in the Oval Office when he was talking about the upping of defense expenditures by the NATO allies was right in tune, again, with what his predecessor Stoltenberg did 10 years ago. And so it pays off, I think, to really be firm and clear with the president about numbers. The president, as a businessman, respects numbers. And when he hears $1 trillion, thanks to your work, Mr. President, that makes a difference for him. We've gone from billions to trillions, haven't we? But nevertheless, I think that Rutte is doing a good job in getting the president to pay more positive attention to NATO than he has in the past.
Take us behind the scenes, because you, of course, know how these summits work. Are NATO leaders quietly trembling about what Trump might do or say that could bring, the whole house down? Or is the NATO house now more stable than it was, say, a year ago?
I do think that the NATO European leaders, as well as Canada, have stepped up now, certainly on defense expenditures, but also they're not assuming that there'll be a return to the status quo ante. One thing I've found in talking to the Europeans particularly is they don't expect the United States to again be the top leader in NATO, the first among equals, always there, always ready to take responsibility for every decision. And so they are starting to take responsibility themselves. Again, I welcome that, and I hope the NATO leaders can hang together. They have been doing well so far in making key decisions about not only defense expenditure, but defense industry decisions as well, cooperating on certain manufacturing and moving forward on this revolution in drone and missile systems that Ukraine has ushered in. So I have high hopes for the future of a more Europeanized NATO, with Canada, of course, also involved. But we will have to see how this summit works out. I will be perturbed if Trump once again threatens to withdraw from NATO or threatens not to respond should NATO be attacked by Russia, the so-called Article 5 commitment of NATO. So we'll see about that. But so far, I don't see any signs that he's going to pull out that biggest of guns this time round.
Would you say that NATO has only changed in its actions, reacting to the behavior of its most powerful member, or has the mentality truly changed within the alliance?
Trump started the momentum going back during his first term in office, but it was really Vladimir Putin's second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 that I think that spelled a sea change for NATO. They really saw that Russia, as an aggressive threat, could come after NATO itself, not only Ukraine. And I think that concern has only been heightened in recent years as Russia has increased its deployments in the west of the country, near the Baltic states, near the newest members of NATO, Finland and Sweden, as well as Norway, of course. So I do think that NATO is convinced now that they have to take responsibility for their own defense. It's a big change from a decade ago.
And Mark Rutte has been talking about NATO 3.0 in that regard. In your opinion, what would a functioning reinvention of the alliance have to look like, and who would take the lead?
There will have to be a functioning leadership cohort, of course, and how that works out, we will see. Traditionally, not only the United States was first among equals, but the so-called Quad, made up of the US, France, UK, and Germany, they were the leading countries inside NATO. How a new leadership coalition takes shape, we will have to see. I would expect some of the larger countries in Central and Eastern Europe, such as Poland, would want to be very much involved in the leadership of NATO. But I think we see some examples of how things might be working, in that the UK in recent years has emphasized this joint expeditionary force. And that means that countries can join and participate without necessarily requiring the full NATO consensus to participate. So we may see more of that kind of more voluntary involvement in major defense tasks. But at the same time, I fully expect to see NATO continuing to hang together and work together because of the way these defense investments are being made, and defense industry investments are being made in a way that really cements the NATO role as the defense and security structure in Europe. And so I do believe that that will continue. The talk about strategic autonomy, the talk about the European Union taking over such a role, I just don't see paying out, because it would be a major additional expenditure on top of the expenditure the allies already have. We have a coherent command structure with NATO, and so do not need to recreate that elsewhere.
Yeah. Donald Trump at this very summit is pushing NATO allies to buy American arms. Wouldn't that stand in the way of a greater independence from the U.S.?
I think there will always be an interest in the U.S. Defense manufacturers, because obviously the United States has a major defense industrial sector and turns out some of the most modern and effective weapon systems. But I think there are new opportunities here. And again, returning to this drone and missile revolution that Ukraine has ushered in, these are opportunities for smaller countries, including in the NATO alliance, but also including Ukraine, to show what they have in terms of innovation capacity. And so I do think that there'll be a Europeanization also in defense acquisitions that will be important for NATO in terms of its sustainability and interoperability going forward. So the U.S. defense industries will always be there, will always play a role, but there's a new opportunity, I think, for innovation in Europe. And I fully expect companies like Rheinmetall also to be playing a role in that.
You mentioned Ukraine a couple of times now. Volodymyr Zelensky is at the summit, once again pleading for more support. European NATO allies and Canada are set to announce a new aid package for Ukraine, some 140 billion euros. They're plugging a gap the U.S. left. At what cost?
No question that the U.S. pulling back from assistance to Ukraine is affecting Ukraine's defense. We see that day in, day out, as Russian ballistic missiles are pounding Ukrainian targets, and Volodymyr Zelensky is begging for Patriot air defense interceptors. One problem, of course, is the United States has burned through a lot of Patriot interceptors in its war in the Middle East, and so there are not a lot to go around. I frankly hope coming out of this summit that Zelensky will get what he wants, and that is a contract to build Patriot interceptors in Ukraine. We'll see if that can happen. It requires a license. Trump says he's positive about it, but we'll see if that can go forward. In addition to which, the U.S. Congress is very supportive of Ukraine, despite what the president says. Just recently, the House of Representatives has voted on a bipartisan basis, $8 billion in assistance for Ukraine. We'll have to see if the Senate supports them as well, but I do think that's a great sign of the bipartisan support for Ukraine, as well as NATO, in the U.S. Congress.
A crucial summit there in Ankara. That was former NATO Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemiller. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you.